The city glittered through the glass walls, a sprawl of steel and light beneath the 52nd floor. I barely noticed. Every breath in the boardroom was caught in Cyrus Halden's smirk. He leaned forward, knuckles pressed to the polished table, his voice sharp enough to slice the air. "You have 1 minute to leave." The words landed like a gavel. Chairs stiffened, hands froze over tablets, and the silence pressed against my ribs. For a heartbeat, I simply sat there, letting the weight of his arrogance wash over me. Then I closed my laptop, the sound deliberate, final, like the lid of a coffin. I rose slowly, straightened my jacket, and met his gaze. The grin on his face told me he expected rage, tears, maybe even begging. Instead, I whispered 2 words that wiped the smirk clean from my own lips, but not his. "Thank you." Gasps flickered around the table. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed folder, its edges crisp, the label blank. I slid it across the mahogany surface until it rested in front of the legal director. My hand lingered just long enough for them to see the steadiness in my fingers. "You'll need this," I said. No one moved. Their eyes darted between the folder and Cyrus, who leaned back in his chair with a scoff. He thought it was some desperate plea, a powerless gesture. He couldn't see the storm bound inside those pages. I turned and walked toward the door. My heels clicked against the marble, each step echoing louder than his authority. Then came the sound that would haunt him more than my words. Chairs scraping, one by one. 15 engineers pushed back from the table. They didn't speak. They didn't look at him. They simply gathered their things and followed me. Their quiet defiance louder than any shouted protest. I didn't need to glance back to know the color had drained from his face, though he covered it with laughter. "Let them go," Cyrus called after us, arrogance coating every syllable. "I'll replace them by Monday." I kept walking, the hallway swallowing us as the glass doors hissed shut. He thought it was over, that he'd humiliated me. He had no idea the real story had only just begun. 10 years earlier, the company wasn't a skyline empire. It was 3 cramped rooms in Fulton Market, the kind where the walls smelled faintly of fried onions from the restaurant downstairs. Cyrus had the charisma, I had the code. Between us, there was just enough bravado and caffeine to convince our first investors we were more than 2 dreamers with borrowed desks. The night that defined us came when our prototype collapsed 2 hours before a client demo. The servers coughed, screens went black, and Cyrus paced the room like a preacher who'd lost his sermon. I locked the door, rolled up my sleeves, and worked 72 hours straight, rewriting architecture line by line until the system hummed back to life. When the demo succeeded, Cyrus took the bow, but the engineers never forgot who had kept the company breathing. I built my team carefully, 1 person at a time. Lucian Vega, brilliant but overlooked, whose resume had been dismissed for lacking Ivy League polish. Mireya Hahn, a quiet coder with a mind like a scalpel, dismissed in interviews for not fitting the culture. Rafiq Almasi, a refugee with an accent too thick for most recruiters, whose algorithms would later outstrip anything on the market. Juniper Lowell, a dropout who taught herself machine learning on a borrowed laptop. They were misfits to the industry, but to me, they were architects of possibility. I gave them chances no one else would, and they repaid me with loyalty that no salary could buy. Nights blurred into mornings with empty pizza boxes stacked against whiteboards, our laughter cutting through exhaustion. I brought blankets from home, and sometimes we slept under the hum of servers. Cyrus drifted in and out, dazzling investors with his vision, while I held the foundation steady. The engineers knew where the real stability came from. They didn't follow me because I was their boss. They followed me because I believed in them long before the world did. Years later, when Cyrus strutted through the boardroom with his smirk, he thought power rested in titles and signatures. He never understood that power had been shifting quietly for a decade, binding itself to me in ways he could never replace. It didn't happen all at once. Betrayal rarely does. It seeps in slowly, a shadow creeping under the door until you realize the room is already dark. At first, it was an email chain about a contract negotiation where my name simply wasn't included. When I asked, Cyrus brushed it off oversight. He claimed with that easy smile. Then came a budget reallocation funds pulled quietly from my department, rerouted to projects he said needed more visibility. I told myself not to overreact. We had weathered worse storms. But the cracks widened. Weeks later, I watched Cyrus stand before the board, delivering a presentation built entirely on my proposal. The slides, the numbers, the diagrams, I knew them like my own skin, yet not once did my name pass his lips. Applause filled the room, and he nodded graciously as if it were his genius that had saved us. I sat in silence, nails pressing half-moons into my palms, telling myself it was only politics. But politics turned to poison. The knife slid deeper when a colleague slipped me an email by mistake, Cyrus promising investors a streamlined future without Cortez. My stomach dropped as I read it, the words wrapping around me like barbed wire. I scrolled again, hoping I'd misread, but the phrase burned into my vision. Days later, the final blow came, preparing for an investor meeting. I opened the leadership slide deck. My title was missing, my photograph erased, my seat at the table replaced with a blank silhouette. I stared at the screen, the hum of the office muffling into silence, and understood the truth. I was no longer his partner. I was his obstacle. The realization settled not as fire, but as ice. Fury would have been easier. Instead, a cold clarity took root. He wanted me erased. He believed he'd already succeeded. I closed the file, leaned back in my chair, and let the betrayal cut as deep as it wanted. Then I smoothed the wound with a single thought. If Cyrus wanted a streamlined future, I would give him one, just not in the way he imagined. I learned quickly that anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. So I wore a mask. In meetings, I smiled at Cyrus's jokes, nodded at his directives, and let him bask in the illusion that he had broken me. The more compliant I appeared, the more careless he became. He thought I was finished. I let him believe it. But nights were mine. In my loft overlooking the Chicago River, the city lights spilled through the windows as I sat hunched over a table littered with legal pads and contracts. The bitterness of coffee kept me awake as I sifted through patents, ensuring every line bore my name alone. I organized resignation letters already signed by the engineers who trusted me more than him. Their loyalty was my fortress. All I had to do was protect it. Every weekend, I met quietly with Nora Vera, an attorney whose discretion was worth every retainer check. We chose a corner booth in a River North cafe, the kind of place where the clatter of cups drowned whispers. She slid folders across the table, and I passed her flash drives filled with documentation, employment records, patent drafts, and the beginnings of a whistleblower report detailing Cyrus's inflated projections. We spoke in half sentences, but she understood me perfectly. Piece by piece, I built something Cyrus couldn't see. Not an exit plan, not a safety net, a weapon. My silence sharpened it daily. Each document another blade, each signature another shield, while he strutted before investors, boasting of his inevitable control. I prepared the quiet detonation that would one day hollow out his empire from within. Sometimes, in those long hours, fatigue pressed heavy on me, and I wondered if patience could hold. But then I remembered the erased slide, my absent photo, and the email that spoke of a future without me. That memory reignited the cold focus in my veins. Cyrus believed silence meant defeat. He had no idea silence could be strategy. And as I slid another signed contract into my folder, I knew the war I was preparing would never need to be loud to destroy him. Damian Cross had a grin that made people forgive his shortcuts. He was all easy charm and quick answers, the kind of engineer who could patch a memory leak and then tell a story about college baseball like he'd lived it. He was younger, hungry, and dangerously useful to the wrong man. Cyrus saw potential in him the way a gambler sees a hot hand. He fed Damien attention. Dinners, small promotions. That attention cost him nothing. It cost me everything. I noticed Damien before anyone else did. Little things, a longer pause when I asked for status updates. A text message he stepped away to take. The way he lingered by Cyrus's office with a laugh a shade too loud. I could have walked straight to him in the hallway and named him traitor. I could have dragged him into the light and made his treachery the boardroom spectacle Cyrus craved. But I had other uses for a man like Damien uses that required he keep believing he was still playing for the winning team. So I fed him carefully chosen crumbs. In private, I began to give him partial truths, half-formed bug reports. A mock architecture diagram with a fake dependency. A staged deadline that would never be met. He rushed to Cyrus with each morsel, anxious to prove his value. "She's lost her edge," he'd say, relishing Cyrus's approving nod. "She's scrambling to hold the team together." Cyrus would laugh, confident, lean back, and say the cruel things people say when they think a threat is dead. Sometimes I watched them from the doorway, a silent presence, as if I were studying a chessboard through glass. I felt nothing like triumph, only a cold, clinical satisfaction. Damien's betrayal was not born of malice alone. It was braided with anxiety, with an ache to be seen, to be promoted, to be secure. You could pity a man like that and still use him. In fact, pity made the manipulation cleaner. He would never suspect someone who felt sorry for him. Each false report he took to Cyrus tightened the noose around the man at the head of the table. Cyrus grew cockier. He made moves in private, began to humiliate me more publicly, to test how far he could push. He bragged to confidants. "She's finished. I'll make her crawl back." He did exactly what I needed. He exposed himself. Letting an enemy believe they had won is the quietest cruelty and the deadliest tactic. And by the time the boardroom clock ticked toward the moment I had prepared for, all that remained was to watch the stage take its cues. Back in the boardroom, the moment unfolded exactly as I had predicted. Cyrus leaned back in his chair after the words left his mouth, savoring them like a toast at a victory dinner. "You have 1 minute to leave," he'd said, and in his mind, that was the end of my career, the end of my relevance. His smile stretched wider, his fingers drumming a self-satisfied rhythm on the glass table. I rose without protest. My voice had already given him my final word. "Thank you." But the echo of those 2 syllables was not what shifted the balance of power. It was the silence that followed, a silence so taut it pressed against every throat in the room. Then the scrape of chairs, first one, then another, then a ripple of sound that cracked his illusion of control. 15 engineers stood, gathered their laptops, and walked toward the door after me. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Their departure thundered louder than any speech I could have made. I didn't look back, but I could hear the sudden hitch in the breathing of the investors, the muttered curses under the breath of board members. Cyrus broke the tension with a laugh that rang false even to him. "Let them go," he said, his voice thick with bravado. "I'll replace them by Monday." But the room didn't move with him. I knew the truth already written on their faces. Those 15 weren't names on an HR list. They were the living core of the company. They had built the code, protected the architecture, carried the innovation that Cyrus paraded as his own. They weren't replaceable. They were the product. The hallway doors closed behind us, and their footsteps joined mine like a single rhythm. Cyrus still thought I had walked away empty-handed, that I would fade into obscurity while he reigned unchallenged. He couldn't see that his empire had just lost its spine, and that the folder I'd left on the table would do what no speech of mine ever could. The silence inside that boardroom was no longer mine. It was his, and soon it would turn into something far worse. I had barely cleared the boardroom doors when I knew the second act of my plan was beginning. The folder I had slid across the table sat in front of Harriet Lowe, the company's legal director. Harriet was not a woman easily rattled. She had the reputation of dissecting lawsuits with the precision of a surgeon. But even she hesitated, her fingertips resting on the seal as if she already feared what lay inside. Cyrus, still lounging in his chair, gave a dismissive wave. "Go on, Harriet. Show us what kind of stunt she thinks she's pulling." His voice dripped with arrogance, but there was a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flicker he couldn't quite hide. At last, Harriet broke the seal. Papers slid neatly into her hands, and her sharp eyes scanned the first set, a whistleblower report, every page marked and notarized, detailing Cyrus's deliberate misrepresentation of revenue projections. Names, dates, internal memos. It was all there in black and white. She flipped to the next set contracts. 15 of them, each binding the engineers who had just walked out to a newly formed LLC under my control. Their signatures, witnessed and filed months before today, confirmed that they hadn't abandoned ship spontaneously. They had left with a destination already charted. Then came the patents, stacked and authenticated, all filed under my name. Innovations Cyrus had paraded as his own were legally tethered to me alone. The boardroom's silence deepened, heavy enough to choke on. Finally, Harriet opened the small pocket at the back of the folder and found a USB drive. She slid it into the laptop at her side, and the screen filled with Cyrus's face. His voice filled the room, smug and unmistakable, as he assured investors in a private meeting that projections were falsified, but nobody will know if we keep the story straight. The video left no room for spin. Harriet's complexion turned ashen. Her voice, steady until now, cracked as she spoke. "Call a lawyer. Now." Cyrus's laugh, which had lingered in the air since my departure, fractured and died. He straightened in his chair, searching the faces around him, but none of them were looking at him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on the evidence and on the truth he could no longer bury. Within days, the ripple turned into a flood. Investors who once orbited Cyrus began shifting their allegiance, their calls routed not to his office but to mine. Etherworks Inc., the LLC I had been quietly assembling for months, was suddenly the new gravitational center. The headlines did the rest. CTO Cortez leads mass exodus. For the first time in years, the truth was printed in bold ink beside my name, not buried in the footnotes of his speeches. The market punished him faster than I could have scripted. His stock plummeted, shedding value in a steady spiral. Analysts dissected every false promise, every doctored slide, while lawsuits piled on his desk like bricks on a coffin. The arrogance that once filled every room with his presence dissolved into absence. He skipped investor meetings. He stopped showing his face at conferences. The empire he thought unshakable collapsed in real time. And I didn't need to lift a finger to help gravity do its work. One evening, Damian Cross appeared at the edge of our new office, a converted warehouse in the West Loop. The man who had sold me out now held his resume like a peace offering, stammering about loyalty, about realizing too late who truly carried the company. I listened in silence. When he was done, I slid the paper back across the desk. "You chose your side," I told him. "Now, live with it." He left without looking back, and I felt nothing. Betrayal teaches you how to cauterize old wounds. Inside the modest office, the air felt different. The whiteboards were covered in fresh sketches, new architecture diagrams, not ghosts of old projects. Laptops glowed into the night as Lucian, Maria, Rafiq, Juniper, and the others worked shoulder to shoulder. I sat among them, not at the head of the table, but beside them, hands ink-stained from my own notes. No hierarchy, no empty titles. Just builders, united by trust. The new roadmap was already pulling in contracts Cyrus had assumed were his birthright. Clients wanted stability, vision, and results, and they knew where those qualities truly lived. We didn't celebrate his downfall. We celebrated our beginning, the quiet satisfaction of knowing the future was ours to write, free from his shadow. The rooftop was quiet except for the hum of the city below, Chicago's skyline flickering against the night like a constellation built of steel and glass. I leaned against the railing, the cool air brushing my face, and let the sounds from inside drift upward: laughter, the clatter of keyboards, the rise and fall of voices trading ideas. My engineers, my partners, were already sketching the next breakthrough. It struck me then how far we had come. Only weeks earlier, Cyrus believed he'd erased me with a single command. He thought humiliation would be my legacy. Instead, his words had become my liberation. His arrogance had set me free to build something stronger, cleaner, untethered from his shadow. I thought back to that boardroom, the smirk, the order, the scrape of chairs, and felt no bitterness now. The memory no longer stung, it glowed with irony. He had given me 60 seconds. But in those 60 seconds, I claimed everything that mattered: loyalty, innovation, and the future. Inside, Lucian and Juniper argued cheerfully over architecture diagrams, while Mireya and Rafik scribbled notes on the whiteboard. It wasn't a company in the corporate sense, it was a community. One stitched together by trust, sharpened by betrayal, and fueled by vision. I straightened, letting the city lights catch in my eyes, and spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the night itself. When he gave me 1 minute to leave, he wrote his own ending, not mine. The words didn't carry anger anymore. They carried certainty. The kind of certainty that comes not from titles or contracts, but from standing in the ruins of someone else's arrogance and realizing you've already built the foundation of your own empire. Below me, the hum of Etherworks continued, alive with possibility. I turned from the skyline and walked back toward the laughter, ready to step into the light of a story that was finally, unmistakably, mine.